Jeremy Epling is with us today discussing Azure Pipelines. Welcome to the Azure DevOps podcast.
The Azure DevOps podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome back to the Azure DevOps podcast. Go online to www.azuredevops.show to see show notes and other episodes. Today, we are speaking with Jeremy Epling. He is the head of product for Azure Pipelines and a principal group program manager at Microsoft. He's been a leader at Microsoft for over 10 years in various roles. And I'm really excited about this interview because there's so much going on in the DevOps space with Azure. So Jeremy, how are you, man?
Hey, I'm doing great. Definitely excited to be here. And just like you said, we've had so many interesting announcements in the last couple of months. And then obviously with the Connect announcements today, a lot of cool stuff's coming out.
Yeah, we're actually recording the day of Connect, and we'll jump into that. You've been at Microsoft for a pretty long time. What groups have you been in? What's your journey been there? Over 10 years now?
Yeah, it's been over 10 years. I've been at Microsoft and kind of worked on a little bit of everything outside of hardware. Worked on Windows for a while, did some security work, did developer API work, some web standard stuff. Then worked on a bunch of consumer products like OneDrive, worked on Office 365 for a while. And then the last few years, I've been kind of in the developer services area, working on Visual Studio Team Services, which we've now rebranded over to Azure DevOps, and then not just rebranded, but added a whole bunch of new functionality on like the new user experience, kind of launched a bunch of new products like Azure Pipelines. So it's been an exciting time, especially these last 6 months or so.
Awesome. So we are actually recording where some of the Connect sessions are literally still going on right now, and this is being published on a Monday. So Connect is actually last week when you're listening to it for listeners right now. And there's some pretty interesting announcements as it relates to Azure Pipelines. Can you give us the rundown of what things were announced?
Yeah, definitely. So we had a couple new things coming out. Obviously, when we launched a couple months ago, one of the big parts of that was our GitHub integration and having a really compelling open source offer. So if you're doing any open source software, it could be on GitHub or it could be somewhere else. We offer unlimited CI/CD minutes and then 10 parallel jobs. So you can just get amazing kind of throughput, even for really large open source projects, especially when you want to test across lots of platforms. And that includes free private agents for Mac, Windows, and Linux. So that was kind of the big offer and a bunch of experience updates we did a few months ago. And one of the things that we've been doing since then is kind of listening to feedback from people on like, how can we make that better? So one of the big things was, hey, we really want integration with GitHub releases. So we've created a new task that you can use to update GitHub releases. You can update an existing one, publish a new one, publish a draft release. So that came out. One of the other things is in pipelines, we have a visual designer that people can use to kind of design their workflow for their pipeline and add tasks. But we also support YAML. But sometimes, you don't want to be jumping back and forth and looking at YAML documentation, and you really wish you just had IntelliSense right there. So we're also shipping a VSCode extension that you can go ahead and get to that has kind of IntelliSense with the YAML parser all built in. So it's really easy to edit the Azure Pipelines YAML file. And then one of the other final things was just some new integration with ServiceNow. So a lot of people like to use ServiceNow for kind of think of a release pipeline to say, hey, I've got a release going out. I want to make sure I have a kind of a change management process on who signed off on it, what the auditing capabilities are. We have some of that, a basic experience kind of built into pipelines, but some people want something that's more full featured or already or deep into the ServiceNow ecosystem and love that experience. So we now have a way to plug that in as a gate. So you can say, hey, I've got a release before it goes to QA. We go out, check to ServiceNow, ask them if everything's okay. They can fire up emails, get approvals, manage the changes, and then kind of at that point, kind of progress it to the next stage of your deployments. So those are kind of three of the big pipelines related announcements today.
That's pretty cool. It's a lot of stuff. If you're taking one at a time, the open source announcement was that increased today, or was it just amplified from from previous leaks? Just curious.
Yeah, so we actually had it. It was part of the announce kind of in September when we did a bunch of the rebrand. And then today, a lot of the messaging was what basically, hey, we've just made the experience a lot better. Like we've added that GitHub releases feature, added some more integration with checks and kind of the richness that you can get of kind of the test results and test failures in the GitHub experience. But one of the really cool things is it's not just the kind of features that came in, it's kind of all the momentum we've seen building from the open source community. So, .NET, we actually just completed like this weekend getting Rosalind like fully moved off their old CI system and on there. So like Rosalind's obviously like the core compiler for .NET, and .NET, it's a huge project, tons of people work on it. And it was really great to see them be able to move over to Azure Pipelines, get a whole bunch of parallelism, see their builds go really fast and have that kind of deep integration. But, it's not only that, like TypeScript has moved over, VS Code, a whole bunch of, .NET type libraries. But then we've also seen a ton of other open source components move over to like the core Python library, Git for Windows, Pipa, Yarn, if you prefer to use that as opposed to like NPM. So there's a whole bunch of projects, and we're just seeing a lot of momentum building, which has just been really exciting for the product. And then for, developers, if it's great if you want to use .NET, but if you want to use something else, or you're, an engineer that can kind of do both, Pipelines is a great product for that as well.
I think that's a huge boon for anyone with open source software, and certainly there's tons of open source from Microsoft on GitHub. But the GitHub releases, that kind of makes it where you have a complete pipeline, because ultimately, if you're an open source project, your production environment is NuGet or NPM or one of the package managers, and then of course being able to post it online. So that really is the full continuous delivery offering, all wrapped into one package. It sounds like. Are there any known gaps that are still being worked on, or has the full breadth been covered now?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like for library development, we've got everything that you need in there. Like if you look at what most open source libraries are, you've got a YAML syntax. You can do config as code, which a lot of developers love. We still have a visual designer if people want to use that, but it's really great for version management, change tracking. Just like you said, you can create one YAML file because we've got conditionals and things like that. You can be like, hey, on my PR build, I maybe want a smaller set of tests to run, and on my CI build, I want a bigger set to run. You can have that all in there. And then you can also say conditionally, like, hey, if all these things pass, I just now want to create a release and, publish this to NPM or publish it to NuGet or whatever else. So you can get that like one end-to-end CI/CD pipeline that can still be kind of adaptive to whatever you need. And then if you want to do more complicated kind of deployments, when you go into pipeline, there's a whole release section of the product where if you want to do larger web service deployments, like maybe like a multi-cloud deployment, have lots of different stages. Maybe you're like a larger company that needs kind of approvals and to track things through rings and want to have quality gates at different stages. That's all built into pipelines as well. So you can, do a simpler kind of open source library project or really complicated web service deployment. And the product just kind of scales seamlessly between those.
Okay, you'd mentioned YAML, which is one of the newer features. One of the things that some of our customers have noticed, and certainly we have, is that once you jump into XAML, you can't go back. You can't go back to the designer once you're in there. And then it's a little bit tricky to go and discover marketplace extensions or tasks that you can pull from the marketplace. So you mentioned IntelliSense with VS Code. How does that work, and what capabilities has that added in?
Yeah, so this is our kind of first version of that. So what it does today is looks at our specific dialect of YAML. YAML is just yet another markup language. So with it, we'll have specific things like we have jobs, and underneath job, it can have steps. And so it'll help you kind of for the syntax for kind of the basic jobs, it'll help you autocomplete that, let you know if there are errors, things like that. What you were asking about for the marketplace, though, is kind of the next set of work that we want to go do. And we're actually actively developing. It was actually in a meeting yesterday. We were looking at some of the design specs for this. And where we want to go is try to build this great hybrid experience for customers where if you want to use YAML and you want that kind of control in your version control system, you can go ahead and do that, but still make it as approachable as the visual designer. So where we want to get to is we're actually getting ready to launch kind of not only this VSCode extension, we're also going to be releasing early next year a more fully featured web editor as well. So just like if you used Azure Repos, like the Git product that we have, or TFEC in Azure DevOps, you can go and edit files and get IntelliSense because it's all Monaco, actually, which is the editor behind kind of VSCode. So we'll have that available on the web as well. But then we also want to make it easy just to kind of have an add button conceptually, like you can go into a pipeline, click edit, you see a YAML editor, you can go type in the task and go, if you know the marketplace name and everything else, but I want to get IntelliSense for that, and then also have a nice kind of like UI-based button where you can just click add, and just like today, when you click add task, you see the list of all the tasks. You can click on one of those tasks, insert the YAML. We've been playing around with things like maybe when you click the task, you can see the properties kind of like you can today, edit those, and then click another button just to insert all the YAML in. Because like you said, like we just want to make it more approachable. So it's not like you're constantly jumping back and forth between docs. It's that great kind of blended experience where, hey, you can still have YAML, still have your pipeline versioned in code. And you can also have a really approachable kind of WYSIWYG experience for getting started and adding like an Azure deployment or, adding Jest tests or Selenium tests or something like that.
So you mentioned Monaco, which a lot of our listeners probably never heard that term before. You're saying that the same editor in VS Code is already in Azure Repos and is going to become the YAML pipeline editor in Azure Pipelines.
Yeah, that's right. So if you think of VS Code, it actually, within Microsoft, was kind of birthed out of this project called Monaco, where originally the team was actually working on just building like a web editor. Like, what if we build a web IDE? And then with the advent of Electron and everything else, we're like, oh, let's just like package it up and make it an app. And, it just exploded. And like everybody uses it and loves it. Like I use it and love it. But one of the building block pieces was actually originally this thing called Monaco. And they actually maintain it as a separate repo on GitHub, so that if you want to use it just on your website, you can actually just host Monaco directly, and you don't get everything that's in VS Code because some of that's like client specific, but you get a lot of it like syntax highlighting, mini map, plugin for like a language service for IntelliSense and things like that. So that's what we host for the YAML editor, or what will be hosted for the YAML editor. And it's what we host today in Azure Repos. So if you go to Azure Repos and you click on edit, you'll get Monaco experience right there. It's a per file one. But if people just go to like the GitHub org and you go to like /Microsoft/Monaco-editor, you can go check it out there. And, I'm sure they'd love contributions to the project or your feedback.
Well, let's take a little pause for a word from our sponsor.
The Azure DevOps podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
All right, back with Jeremy Epling. So what you're saying is pretty phenomenal going forward. I'm just wondering how long it's going to be until people can use it. You're going to have a rich YAML editor right there in the build configurations, and you're going to be able to have IntelliSense on steps, and then also be able to discover what steps might be out there in the marketplace. Right?
Definitely. Yep.
And how about the release? How about the release hub? Because that's kind of historically been a separate piece. How's that coming along?
Yeah, it's coming along well. We see just a ton of growth in that area of a lot of people using it, especially for like web service deployment, and for all kinds of different ones. Like sometimes it's .NET, sometimes it's Java. But the kind of one of the things that we're looking at going in the long term is trying to build up like YAML. Like one of the things that I hear from customers a lot is, hey, I want to be able to have a single pipeline that can do build and release. So one of the things that we're going to be adding It's actually behind a feature flag now, but not available to the public yet, but will be early next calendar year, is the ability to have multi-stage support. So we're going to grow up inside the build experience, that YAML file, so it can support more of those experiences as well. So a lot of times this request comes on user voices like, hey, I want release YAML, and I want them to be more merged. So that's one of the things we're looking at is kind of how do we kind of grow that up so that if you want to have a separate CI and CD YAML, yep, you can go ahead and do that, and that's going to be a great experience. But if you want to have one single pipeline and maybe some conditionals and other things like that, you can go ahead and do that as well. So that's kind of a lot of the work that we're looking at in the first quarter of next year is like making that YAML editor great, the normal stuff like performance, customer feedback, and then also just trying to make that experience grow up. So we have just an awesome CD experience for YAML and kind of growing that up more for people.
So how close are we to the truly forkable experience where you can fork the source control right now, and that works great. But if you create a new project, you fork it from an existing Git repo, and then boom, the entire pipeline, all the environments just get built up because it's stored in source control. And if there's ARM templates, if you stick in your Azure subscription, how close are we to that all-encompassing fork it all?
Yeah, I think we're getting pretty close with it, but we're not quite there yet. So, let's say I have a GitHub repo and you fork it. You're going to pull that into kind of your own personal account. So you would still need to go and set up Azure DevOps on your account. So you could go and install our GitHub app. But once you install our GitHub app, at that point, you forked it. And because the YAML file is in the code, you've got the YAML file right there. So the only things that you would need to kind of replicate, if you will, in your pipeline would be things like secrets or, some environments or something that you've chosen to say, hey, I want to control this outside of my code, which for some customers, especially for secrets, that one's kind of obvious. You don't want, your secrets in an open source Git repo. But sometimes there's other variables where you're just like, hey, I'm playing with something, or I want to give, a release manager control of this variable. So you'd want to pull those out of the code so they don't have to maybe necessarily go do a code change. So it's a small set of things, but once you got that GitHub app configured in your org, in the Azure Pipelines files there, it's just a couple clicks to get it all set up. And then it's a matter of if you're using these features, you need to go move over the secrets. If not, a lot of it's just going to build and just go. So
is that aimed for Q1 YAML release hub?
Yeah, I think that it's definitely high on the list. So I hear the feedback from a lot of people. I'm not sure exactly when we'll get it, but that's it's definitely what we're working on now. So I can't commit to say, it'll definitely be Q1 or this thing, but yeah, it's high on the list, and we're definitely working on it right now.
Yeah, I'm just fast forwarding into the future, and I think we have to arrive at a place where you clone a Git repository and it's everything. Yep. Whereas right now we talk about release hub and the build configuration, but then there's also the am I using private or am I using the pools? And if you're using a private build server, okay, what's the PowerShell to create your private build server? And it needs SQL Server Developer Edition. I mean, just holistically, there's secrets that you have to poke in, but other things like I'm going to automatically trigger a release configuration upon continuous integration build, and I'm going to have an approval versus not have an approval. And so some of those are Azure Pipelines settings, but I mean, those are things that you would have to go and click around after the fork. If you were just to say, hey, I want the pit of success. I want to be able to just copy some skeleton of a project and hit the races, off to the races.
And I think for a lot of those you can. And I think it's something we're always asking that question of how far can we push config as code? You know what I mean? At what point does it feel weird to do this change in code? And overall, our default is to always make sure everything is in YAML. So there's a lot of things that you can do. You can just specify the variables in YAML and do other stuff. Outside of secrets, it's the only one that's really a hard separation. But it's also something that we're always kind of pushing on, because I agree, in a lot of the open source libraries, because their CI is more straightforward and doesn't need some of these more complicated deployment concepts, a lot of them I just fork and it can just build. Or like I'll look at a project and I'll fork it myself and be like, hey, I wonder if I can get this running with pipelines. And it's like pretty easy. And I just submit a PR back to them and they can go ahead and get it running. But I definitely think it's clear that the future is config as code, and we're just trying to figure out how far can we push it, or where are cases where we need to be able to support both if a company needs flexibility.
Yeah. You mentioned Rosalind being converted just briefly, but how does that impact the lives of the listeners today versus maybe down the road?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things, if you're contributing to Rosalind, or even if you're just obviously using it as a .NET developer, their build times, they're going to have so much more parallelism than they had before. And with a lot of the performance work we've done, all the builds should just be faster. So hopefully that's making the Rosalind team a lot more productive, so that they're getting, changes and bug fixes and things like that to you a lot faster. So that's been one of the good ones. One of the other interesting things about pipelines is I feel like if you look across all the CI/CD offerings out there, like we really have a lot of really strong information on the test analytics side, and we've continued to kind of invest in that. And I know Rosalind has been using that pretty heavily, just to kind of see like what are all the tests that are running. And because obviously if you want to have a big scaled project, you want to make sure, that it's well tested, or else you're not going to be able to move that fast. And so if you go to pull up one of their results, you can click on like a test tab there. And, on any single build run, they have almost 500,000 tests running right now.
Wow.
And one of the cool things about our project is like if there's ever a failure, you can go in and see what the failures are. You can dig in, see if it's a new failure, an old one. Has that test gotten longer? Is it taking more time? The duration's increasing. When did it start increasing? What's the pass rate like for all the tests or an individual test? So at least one of the things I've noticed whenever I'm doing development work, like it's, something breaks and you're like, why did this thing break? And it's like, oh, should I blame myself? But like, it's really easy. You can go to the test tab and look and be like, oh, this broke 2 builds ago. So it's probably unlikely it's not me. Let me click and see who made that change and like bug them and be like, hey, are you fixing this? Have you figured out what's going on? So trying to get you to that point of like taking those next steps so you can get kind of, insights is kind of like the word that we use on the team. Instead of just like, here's a bunch of data, we can help you kind of get to the conclusion you're looking for of like, okay, when did this thing break? Is it going slower? Did I cause the issue or somebody else? Instead of kind of just a wall of data, or in a lot of cases, just no data at all. And you're just kind of left sitting there being like, okay, it errored out. I don't know why. Let me go spend an hour figuring it out.
Yeah, that can be frustrating. I think everybody's dealt with that. With all the open source stuff going on in public projects, and there's a lot going on in the build space, and then of course forking the source, and whether you put your Git repository in GitHub or put it in Azure Repos. But with these test features and public projects, is there any progress, or are there any projects that are public that you know of that have been set up that demonstrate the interconnectedness of all of these features so that it really creates a productive environment for teams to work in?
Yeah, I actually feel like Rosalind is actually set up really well. That's a good one for people to look at. Another good one is actually Atom itself. So if you go to GitHub, just like there's VSCode, they've been working on an editor called Atom. They've actually moved over to ours. The Core Electron project has moved over as well. And I think they do a good job. Theirs are a little bit more approachable than Rosalind. Rosalind's so big and it does so much because so many people contribute and they have to build on so many different things. Sometimes when you get into their YAML file and looking through it, it's just really advanced. So I think starting off looking at like Atom or VSCode are definitely more approachable, where you'd be like, okay, it's one of these client apps. I can see really clearly it's going to build on Windows, Mac, and Linux. And here's kind of, the conditions and things that they're doing to decide like which tests run here and reporting those tests up. So I feel like those are all great projects to look at. There's another one called Parcel. It's a popular JavaScript framework there that also, I think, has a really clean kind of YAML file that's easy for people to see. And one of the things they do, which I like, is they leverage this feature called templates. And what templates allow you to go do is to say, hey, just like using a function in code, you're like, hey, here's my YAML file, but I want to externalize part of my YAML file in another file. So, they would go through and the YAML file basically be like, hey, I've got jobs and I've got job like 1, 2, and 3. And, one runs on Windows, the next one runs on Mac, the next one runs on Linux. And then they can externalize kind of the common bits, steps, or like all the steps for those in separate files in case maybe you have to, you can't keep the build super consistent across all 3, or you want to specialize it. So it's one of those powerful features, and you can actually take the templates and pass parameters into the templates to kind of drive them down. And for these larger projects, it's really powerful, especially at like larger companies where you want to kind of have a standard way everybody does their build, but still allow flexibility to people. You can kind of share out these templates, and these templates don't even need to be in the same repo. You can actually import them from another repo. So you could have like an Azure Repos repo or a GitHub repo where you have all your common build templates at, your company or your project, and then people are kind of reusing those from other organizations or other repos. So it gives you this nice way to kind of mix and match pieces together and, reuse bits of YAML to, create the pipeline that you're looking for.
Okay, so I found, you mentioned Atom is one of the 3, and on the GitHub page for Atom, they have a link over to the Azure Pipeline for the show notes, dev.azure.com/github/atom, ATOM. So they have that Atom nightly build running, and they definitely have a lot of activity going through here. All right, so that'll be interesting for everyone to look at.
Yeah.
Awesome. And is there a discoverable way to search or peruse public projects at this point?
No, we don't have that today. Probably the best way to go do it if you're trying to see who all is using Azure Pipelines would just be to kind of search GitHub for it, and you'll find our YAML file and a bunch of the repos. But we don't have a way today in Azure DevOps to go do that. But it's something we've definitely heard from people. So it's something we've got on the list. It's not really high now, but people vote up things on like developer community and other things are a great way to kind of send us feedback on like, hey, we think this is more important than that. Because guarantee you, like I start my day almost every day by reading our NPS feedback, the little surveys that people get, probably never more than like every 6 months, and the product will pop something up, be like, how happy are you? I read all those comments. I read all the ones that come across developer community, and we look at them all. So we definitely want to be building a product that we feel like is like great, for the audience we have, and then hopefully expanding it to like an even bigger set of people.
Yeah, well, certainly Azure Pipelines. I don't think there's anything else on the market that even comes to the level of sophistication of just be click, 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 and you can have everything up and running. I mean, there's certainly software that you can install on your own box, and then there's services that do run in the cloud, but they don't have the same depth that Azure DevOps does and just coverage across everything.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I feel like we're in a really awesome position with the product. I mean, when you look at it, like you said, it's like, we've got it all in the cloud, but the nice thing is like everything that we have in the cloud is also available on-prem too. So, I feel like most customers I talk to, they're all moving to the cloud, and a lot of them are already there. But every now and then there's some for certain reasons they need on-prem, and it's great just to say like, hey, we've got parity across here. Like what you see up here is what you see there. Same for like all the open source work we do. Whenever we're running open source builds, we've got the unlimited minutes across Mac, Windows, Linux, 10 concurrency, which is great. But we run that on the exact same hardware that our paying customers run on with the same SLAs. We don't degrade your experience or anything like that, like some other CI systems do. It's that same production quality. So we know like open source software is just as important as what you're doing at your private company.
Yeah. One of the newer features in the pipeline for the build agents and just environments in general is Windows Container. And I know there's some features that are available now, and then there's lots of other features that are still on the roadmap. Could you give us the rundown of what people can be using now versus what maybe they should look for 2019 for?
Yeah, so we have some basic early support for Windows containers now that's out there with the current version of Windows Server. But yeah, with 2019, it's going to get a lot more mature, and we're working on getting a hosted image out. This will be like very early in Q1, probably in January. It'll be out on our service for people to start to play with and deploying and using Windows containers. I mean, I think it's pretty clear if you look across the trends, whether it be Windows or Linux, that containers is just where most people are moving to. And Windows will have like OCI compliant containers, and it's just a really powerful way. And there's kind of multiple ways to think about containers. when you think about CI, one of them is like, hey, I want to deploy my web service and I want that thing running in a container. So we have support for pulling containers from different registries, Docker Hub, building them, pushing them out. It could be ACR, it could be to Docker Hub, wherever else, and plugging into, Azure Container Service or Azure Container Instances, or, you can even do it to GKE or AWS. But yeah, so we've got that side of it. Another thing that customers often ask about is they're like, hey, I want to get better reproducible builds. And I want to do that by running my build inside a container or a specific job in my build in a container. So one of the things you could do is say, hey, I want to pull the, .NET Core container down, and I want all of my build steps and scripts to run in this exact .NET Core container. And you could bring your own, you could pull the other one, run it there. Then maybe the next job is going to do something different in a different container. So one of the nice things is you don't have to worry about a VM that has like 1,000 tools installed on it. And, maybe you're worried that, some of them might be conflicting or not, especially if you're using like private agents and installing them yourselves. You can make sure that it's like, hey, I know all of my scripts are running or tasks are running inside this one container. I know what it is. I've got it locked and you're in control of it. So you get these really reproducible build environments, and you can have you can have those running in parallel, multiple different jobs, kind of build a graph of all of those different jobs. So it's kind of another way to think about containers. You can create containers, you can be running your CI/CD process inside of a container, or you can be deploying containers, and we kind of have great support for all of those scenarios.
I think if you're a .NET developer, which almost all of the listeners here are, that is one innovation that's going to be, I think, one of those few game changers across the .NET world. Certainly physical to virtual hardware was a game changer, and then click a button and you got a VM up and running, or write PowerShell and you can spin up and spin down resources. But now containers with configuration, there's so much configuration that doesn't fit inside of a NuGet package. And so you can deploy a lot of stuff, but then there's other stuff you have to poke in, you have to configure it just right. And even if you're going 100% PaaS on Azure, there's still configuration that you have to manage off to the side. Whereas I think I'm not sure how close it is to GA, but the container support for app service in Azure, that's going to be huge, just to be able to, because there's so many applications that don't need elastic scale, and it's all about maintainability and management. You just, boom, there's a container. This is exactly what I want running. Keep it running for me. If your data center goes down, just spin it up somewhere else without me doing anything.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the things we've been investing in. Like, we have a built-in set of Azure tasks, and they all have support for pushing to ACR, ACI, like you said, app service. There's app service for containers. So people can kind of push all their containers up into those and deploy into those. And a lot of the work we're doing right now is to flush that out even more. So it's just a more seamless, easy experience for people to get it hooked up. And then, just continuing to flush that out so it gets more rich as like the Azure infrastructure and compute teams are adding more features. We want to make sure those are like instantly coming to Azure pipelines and involved in our tasks. Like, we definitely want to have a broad support and great support for an open source community and like working with any cloud. But, if you're betting on Azure, we want to make sure that you have the latest and greatest tools for everything that's coming out with Azure.
And you also mentioned in Azure Pipelines, one feature that I don't see a lot of people talking about is the Windows container hosted agent in Pipelines itself. So can you give it, you select that versus a regular hosted agent. And I notice, maybe it's coincidental, but the Windows hosted container seems to shave off about 30 seconds of runtime off of a .NET Core total build with all the steps built in. Is that expected or is that coincidental?
I haven't dug into it. I have noticed that it is a little bit faster, that specific build, because it's a specific build of Windows Server that we're basically like running it on. And I know they've been kind of optimizing around these scenarios. So I don't think I can take credit for that one as we're doing anything magical on the Azure Pipeline side. I think it's just Windows for that specific image that we're using. And then in the 2019 one, I expect it to get the container support to get even faster and more seamless when we have that. And that'll be the kind of build that's carried over from these. If you say, hey, I want Windows containers, eventually we're going to give you Server 2019 with the latest and greatest on there.
Yeah, 'cause I think everybody wants to use the hosted build agents.
Yep.
But then you have just a little bit of overhead in provisioning, and then the fresh restore and git clone. And because you have a new VM every time, there's no possibility of caching anything from previous build runs. Whereas, for a lot of old timers like me who are using cruisecontrol.net with a sea of XML in 2005, it was pretty fast because you didn't have to absolutely clean your working copy every time, and you could have cached things that didn't make a difference from build to build. But if you have an absolutely clean build agent every time, there's no opportunity for caching, so you get a little bit of the overhead. I'm wondering if the Windows container is set up so that those VMs are just there, and the container agent, containers in general are faster to get online than a VM image. Yeah. So I'm wondering if natively we're just going to gain a number of seconds because of that architecture.
Yeah, I think I'm hopeful we're eventually going to get there. Today, right now, at least on Linux, and I don't think Windows is quite there for 2019, though I can't speak for the Windows Server team for sure, but I know on Linux, it's not really a trusted boundary from a multi-tenant environment. Like, I don't feel comfortable saying I'm going to run company's A's code in one container on the same VM that I'm running company B code. It's not quite there yet on Linux, and I think they're trying to get there, and there's a bunch of people that are active in multiple projects to get there. But I think we can get there, and then we'll get more. So today, when you get those, you do get a fresh VM. There's a lot of things we do to make that experience better. Like, if you were, or if one of your listeners was kind of like using the service this summer before we did the rebrand, and you were noticing like slow kind of like spin up times on the hosted agents, we have done a ton of performance work since then. So I would definitely give it another try. We're much faster now. We have like a smart pooling system that kind of keeps a lot of VMs hot and warm for people. So the second you get it, we've already got a VM up there that's imaged, that's ready to go. But what you mentioned about caching, like obviously one option is just, hey, you own your own VMs, put a private agent on there, whether it be an Azure VM or on-prem hardware, you can go do that. But a lot of people want the elasticity of hosted. So this is definitely something we're looking at in Q1 is like, what are the more advanced kind of caching mechanisms we can build so people can reuse kind of build outputs across multiple runs of their build. So you could say like, hey, downloading all of my NuGet packages is really expensive, running the commands to do the restore and everything like that. It'd be awesome if we could just kind of hyper optimize that and cache it. So the second I get a new VM, like we can do a smart intra data center kind of like copy. And have all the data just like right there on the VM. So those are some of the performance scenarios. We're looking at Q1 and doing some of that automatically, but then still giving you as like the developer the power to kind of override and be like, no, actually, I want to say how it's going to work and what the cache key is and how it gets invalidated. I think these are all the types of things that we're looking at and want to ship out in Q1 to make that scenario easier for people. Because my gut, and people can always comment on like dev community or tweet at me. It's like Jeremy_Epling on Twitter. Because I'd love to hear feedback on this because it's an area we talk about a lot internally around, where do we want to go? Like kind of the two questions we talk a lot about is one of them is this notion of more flexibility in our hosted pools so people can pick their own VM SKUs, they could bring their own images, more caching and other things. Another option is to say maybe you do that or maybe you also say, hey, what if private agents, people just want to have private agents, grab their own VMs from Azure. They can pick exactly what they want because we're never going to be able to give infinite flexibility in the hosted pool, but we handle this elasticity for you. So you don't have to think, you're not paying for all the Azure minutes of them all sitting around. We'll automatically spin them up and down for you. So that's one where, I'd love your opinion and other people's opinions on like what's more important, what more is more valuable to them as we're trying to work through prioritizing this stuff. Yeah.
Well, there's, I think, a lot of potential here. With Windows containers, I know there's Azure Container Registry out there, and so if I needed a certain instance of SQL Server or some other dependency on my build server because of the architecture of my system, and I made a container that essentially was derived from one of the blessed images, and it was in my container registry, then I would just want to choose that as the hosted image and say, hey, whenever it's needed, just grab it and spin it up for me. I don't ever want, because the main thing is maintenance, security patches. If you own the whole VM image, then you have to maintain that entire operating system. With the container architecture, you can add dependencies, but you don't have to manage patching.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I think as more people move to containers, the easier it is. And if your whole system lives in, Linux or Windows, that's great. The only reason I'm kind of always have Linux or VM images in the back of my mind is mainly because of Mac support. Like there's no real native support there. And some of these open source libraries want to be able to build across all three. But I agree, the more all in you get in containers, and if you're focused on those on Windows and Linux, you can bring a lot of that. And one of the great things that we're adding support for is like not only like you said, like you can run your build inside a container and bring that in an environment. We're doing work to kind of have these what we've called internally sidecar containers. So when you spin up kind of a job, you can say, hey, I want all my code to run inside this container. But then a lot of people want to do, like you said, like DB testing. And they're like, on that same agent, I don't only want to have like the .NET container over here. I want to spin up like a SQL or a MySQL, some other containers next to it to kind of do some functional or integration testing right there, all in the same VM. But like from my perspective, it's just containers. We're enabling you to do that kind of early in Q1 to go ahead and specify these different sidecars and kind of set up these configurations so that you can do this kind of database or integration style testing. Again, all with containers, so you don't have to worry about downloading, installing tools, managing the agents, things like that.
Nice. Yeah, it's going to be great. I had a conversation last week with Matt Cooper. We were talking about hosted agent speeds and container options and all that because I think just like dog fooding everything else, probably one of your missions is to get everybody inside of Microsoft using the hosted agents for all of their stuff because they're probably pretty particular about performance and speed.
Definitely. And Matt Cooper is actually the PM that's on this and working on that in the sidecar work. So he's a great person to talk to. Internally, we have pretty much every team everywhere is on Azure Pipelines. To some degree, we still have some custom infrastructure for building huge projects like Windows, where Azure Pipelines does the orchestration, the overall, but then we have this kind of super smart build engine called Domino and Cloud Build that we kind of kick it off and manage the test results and running it, but then it does advanced caching because, building Windows, it's so big, it can take a long time. But again, over time, just like you said, we're always working with those teams to be like, okay, what do we need to make hosted good enough for you? And we've gotten a lot of teams on hosted, but we're always trying to figure out how do we make it better. The latest push internally has kind of been a lot of compliance features on hey, what can we go do to make sure that it's easier to kind of audit the service and to give those kind of compliance controls so that customers can say, hey, I need to make sure antivirus or, this security scan runs on every single build. Is there an easy way to kind of enforce that across my organization? So it's one of the great things kind of about working at Microsoft is we get to build all of the tools for ourselves and solve a whole bunch of these cases at massive scale. And then customers can just take it and run with those and just trust that it's going to be able to scale to these really large numbers or large organizations.
Yeah, and it works. It works. And there's so many people scaling things up. And then there's the crowd, the massive crowd of people that have maybe simpler software from a scale perspective, but it's just big. There's a lot of functionality and maintenance. The set it and forget it function is huge about not having to maintain all these servers for the infrastructure. And you can just say, hey, here's my app. That's my entire world. But if I build it on Azure DevOps and if I run it in Azure, it just works and it's reliable. That's huge too.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that's when I think of the mission of our team, it's really all about enabling people to be productive. It's everybody wants to be spending time on the part of their product or engineering the stuff where they offer the most value. You don't want to be messing with a build system and doing all this. You want it to just work and disappear, right? And to and you only need to interact with it when you need to make a decision about oh, I need to roll this out to the next set of customers, right? Or oh, there was a failure, but I want to quickly know it was my test and how I introduced it or whatever it was and figure that out. And that's kind of our goal, is kind of just enabling people to be super super productive on the areas where they should be spending their time, and the rest of the system just works.
Yeah. I think there's a quote that's gaining popularity. The best technology is invisible technology.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm not sure who said that first, but anyway. Well, hey, is there anything else that you want to leave the listeners with, or resources that they should check up on before we go here?
No, I think the only last thing is definitely, tweet at us, hashtag Azure DevOps or at Azure DevOps. I'm always interested to get feedback on the product, on pipelines, and anything else to figure out how we can make it better. So any of your listeners should feel free to reach out to me with their thoughts, what they love, what they hate, what they think we can go do better. I'm always interested. Awesome.
Well, thanks so much, Jeremy, for visiting with me. It was great.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And until next week, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.